Here is the paradox that the power cartographer sees when mapping Xi Jinping's Law of the Jungle speech. The country warning the world against the law of the jungle has the largest unsanctioned nuclear arsenal in the global south, has militarized disputed islands in international waters in violation of an international tribunal ruling, has conducted the largest aerial surveillance operation in modern history against a neighboring democracy, and has built the most sophisticated apparatus for suppressing domestic dissent in the digital era. And yet the speech is not wrong. That is the paradox. The substance of what Xi said, that a world governed by unpredictable unilateral power rather than institutional rules is dangerous for smaller states, is accurate. The messenger's credibility on that substance is deeply compromised. And the global audience that received the speech knows both of those things simultaneously, which is why the speech is more sophisticated than it appears, and more revealing than Beijing intended. The invisible chain connecting this speech to Beijing's real strategic position runs not from Chinese values to Chinese rhetoric, but from Chinese vulnerability to Chinese messaging. When Xi Jinping warns against the law of the jungle, he is not primarily making an argument about international norms. He is revealing a fear, a specific, documentable fear that the coverage has not named directly. The fear is not American strength. China has spent 2 decades building its military, its economy, and its diplomatic relationships specifically to manage American strength. The fear is American unpredictability.
A China that can model American behavior, anticipate American decisions, and build its strategy around American patterns can manage the relationship. A China that is facing an American administration whose positions reverse in 3 hours, whose ultimatums dissolve under Allied pressure, and whose Gulf policy oscillates between maximum pressure and extension, that China is navigating a strategic environment that its planning apparatus was not designed to handle. The law of the jungle speech is Beijing's way of saying, we preferred the old rules, not because we always followed them, but because at least they were predictable. Tonight I want to map what this speech is actually doing. The invisible chain that connects it to the global South audience that is its real target. The specific distinction between Beijing's rules-based order and Washington's that is the hidden mechanism of the soft power competition, and the vulnerability it reveals about Chinese strategic planning in an era of American unpredictability. I map how states use public rhetoric as a strategic instrument, how the choice of framing, the selection of audience, and the calibration of message content reveal the underlying strategic position of the speaker more reliably than the explicit content of what is said. Xi Jinping's Law of the Jungle speech is a masterclass in this kind of strategic communication, and dissecting it reveals more about Beijing's current anxieties than about its confidence. Let me show you the map. One sentence. Xi Jinping's Law of the Jungle speech is not primarily an argument about international norms. It is a soft power offensive aimed at global South countries whose alignment is the real prize in the US-China competition, built on a specific distinction between Beijing's multilateral rules-based order and Washington's alliance-based rules-based order. That is the invisible chain connecting this speech to every diplomatic decision China is making in the Gulf crisis. Start with who Xi was actually speaking to, because the primary audience was not the Western media that covered the speech or the American policymakers it was implicitly addressing. The primary audience was the 50 to 60 countries in the global South, in Africa, Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, that are in the process of making the most consequential alignment decision of the current era. Whether to treat US-led international institutions and alliances as the framework within which they organize their external relationships, or whether to treat the emerging Chinese alternative architecture, the Belt and Road, the BRICS expansion, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Global Security Initiative, as a viable alternative framework. For those countries, the law of the jungle framing lands very differently than it does in Washington or Brussels. Many of them have direct experience with what the law of the jungle felt like under 19th century European imperial management, under 20th century Cold War proxy conflicts, and under 21st-century conditional development assistance that arrives with political requirements attached. When Xi warns against a world in which powerful states impose their preferences on smaller ones without institutional constraint, he is speaking to an experience that is real in the historical memory of his primary audience, even if the speaker's own record on respecting smaller states' sovereignty is deeply inconsistent. The alignment calculation that those countries are currently running is not primarily about ideology. It is about predictability and reliability. Which external partner can they build long-term economic plans around? Which partnership architecture will still be functioning in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? American alliance structures have, in recent years, provided less predictability on those dimensions than they did in previous decades, as trade relationships are disrupted by tariff reversals, as security commitments are conditionally re-evaluated, as international institution participation fluctuates with administration changes. Chinese engagement, whatever its limitations, has maintained a higher degree of continuity. The law of the jungle speech is aimed at that continuity calculation. Now map the distinction between Beijing's rules-based order and Washington's, because this is the invisible chain that the coverage consistently fails to trace, and it is the distinction that makes Xi's speech more than simple hypocrisy. Washington's rules-based international order is an alliance-based order. Its core institutions, NATO, the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, the Five Eyes intelligence architecture, are alliance structures that provide their members with security guarantees, intelligence sharing, and economic access in exchange for alignment with American strategic objectives. The rules of this order are enforced primarily through these alliance structures, supplemented by multilateral institutions, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, that the United States helped design and in which it exercises disproportionate influence. The order is real, its benefits are substantial for those inside it, and its enforcement mechanisms are powerful. It is also explicitly hierarchical. There are inside countries and outside countries, and the terms on which outside countries might become inside countries are set by Washington. Beijing's rules-based order, as articulated in Xi's speech, in the Global Security Initiative, in the Global Development Initiative, and in China's stated positions at the UN, is a sovereignty-based multilateral order. Its core principles are non-interference in internal affairs, sovereign equality of states regardless of size or power, and multilateral decision-making through UN institutions rather than through alliance structures that exclude non-members. The rules China advocates for are the ones that most constrain the ability of powerful states to impose conditions on weaker ones. The rules that would prevent the United States from attaching political conditions to development assistance, from conducting freedom of navigation operations in waters China claims, and from organizing alliance structures that encircle Chinese interests. The distinction is not between a rules order and a no-rules order. It is between two different rule architectures with different beneficiaries. Washington's order benefits the countries inside the alliance structure, primarily wealthy democracies and their close partners. Beijing's order benefits countries that want to conduct their internal affairs without external conditionality, primarily authoritarian governments and developing economies that chafe at the political requirements attached to Western development assistance. The Global South audience that Xi was addressing in the Law of the Jungle speech is, in significant proportion, precisely the constituency that benefits most from Beijing's sovereignty-based rule architecture rather than Washington's alliance-based one. Now map the fear that the speech reveals, because the most analytically valuable content of any political communication is not what the speaker chose to say, but what the choice of message reveals about the speaker's underlying anxieties. Xi Jinping warning against the law of the jungle in a specific geopolitical moment, the Gulf crisis, the Trump administration's 3-hour extension reversal, the seizure of a Chinese origin vessel, Is Beijing communicating something more precise than a general preference for multilateralism? The invisible chain runs from the 3-hour reversal directly to this speech. An American administration whose positions reverse under Allied pressure within hours is an administration whose behavior cannot be reliably modeled by Chinese strategic planners. Chinese foreign policy planning operates on 5-year time horizons coordinated with party Congress cycles, on Belt and Road project timelines measured in decades, on military modernization schedules calibrated to specific capability benchmarks. All of that planning assumes a minimum level of predictability in the American strategic environment, not American weakness, but American consistency. A consistent adversary is manageable. An unpredictable one is genuinely destabilizing to a planning apparatus built around long-term horizon modeling. The specific things that American unpredictability is threatening that Chinese planners most value: the trade relationship that funds Chinese development, the financial architecture that Xi's administration has been building as an alternative to dollar dependency, the diplomatic positioning that the Xi-Salman call represents, and the Hormuz stability that the 90% purchase arrangement depends on. Every one of those assets is more exposed to damage from American unpredictability than from American strength. A strong but predictable America is an adversary Beijing can build around. An unpredictable America that reverses ultimatums, seizes Chinese origin vessels, and oscillates between maximum pressure and extension. That America is an adversary that makes every Chinese long-term investment calculation more uncertain. The law of the jungle speech is Beijing asking, in diplomatic language, for the kind of American predictability that the current administration is specifically not providing. Now map the soft power competition that the speech is participating in, because it is real, it is consequential, and it is playing out in real time in the alignment decisions of precisely the global South countries that will determine which of the two competing international order architectures achieve sufficient scale to be self-sustaining. The soft power competition between Washington and Beijing is not primarily a competition of values, despite how both sides frame it. It is a competition of reliability. Which external partner delivers what it promises? Which partnership architecture produces consistent benefits for the countries that engage with it? Which framework for international relations produces more predictable outcomes for smaller states navigating a world of great power competition? Those are the questions that global South countries are answering through their specific partnership choices. Which port concession to grant? Which telecommunications infrastructure to accept? Which multilateral institution to prioritize? Which security relationship to cultivate? The scoreboard on that competition, as of this moment, is genuinely mixed. Not the clean Chinese advantage that Beijing projects, or the clean American advantage that Washington asserts. Chinese reliability in Belt and Road delivery has been inconsistent, projects delayed, debt terms renegotiated, infrastructure quality disputed. American reliability and security guarantees has been strong within the alliance structure, but weakening at the margins. Chinese non-conditionality in development assistance is genuinely attractive to governments that face political conditions from Western donors. American economic dynamism and technological leadership remain genuinely attractive to countries seeking to develop their own technology sectors. The competition is real, neither side is clearly winning, and the law of the jungle speech is Beijing's move in that competition. An attempt to capture the narrative of institutional multilateralism at a moment when American behavior is making that narrative credible to its target audience. Now trace the specific way the Gulf crisis has created the opening for this speech, because the timing is not coincidental. Beijing did not choose to make this argument in a period of American institutional predictability and multilateral engagement. It chose to make it at the precise moment when the most visible American foreign policy behavior, the 3-hour reversal, the seizure of a Chinese origin vessel, the ceasefire extension without operational content, makes the law of the jungle framing most resonant with its target audience. The Gulf crisis has provided Beijing with a specific gift for the soft power competition, a running demonstration in real time of exactly the kind of American unpredictability that Xi's speech warns against. Every ceasefire reversal, every extension without terms, every boarding operation in international waters that the United States defends as lawful and Iran calls piracy, each of those events is available to Beijing as evidence for the proposition that American behavior in the Gulf illustrates the law of the jungle rather than the rules-based order. China does not need to fabricate this evidence. It is being generated continuously by the American administration's own conduct. Beijing's communication apparatus needs only to reframe and amplify it for the global South audience that is the real target. The specific countries most receptive to this framing right now are the ones managing their own relationships with both Washington and Beijing simultaneously. The Gulf states themselves, whose alignment calculations we traced in previous videos, and the wider group of countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America that are watching the Gulf crisis and updating their own assessments of American reliability as a long-term partner. For those countries, the law of the jungle speech arrives at a moment when American behavior in the Gulf has made its core argument more credible than it would have been in a period of American institutional predictability. Now map the specific contradictions in the speech that the geopolitically curious viewer needs to understand, not to dismiss it, but to read it accurately. The contradictions are real, and they are the most revealing content in the speech, because the gap between Beijing's stated multilateralism and Beijing's actual behavior maps the precise boundaries of the Chinese alternative order. South China Sea. China has built military installations on disputed reefs and islands in the South China Sea in explicit defiance of a 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling that found the installations violated international law. The smaller states whose sovereignty and fishing rights are directly affected by those installations, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, are precisely the countries that Xi's law of the jungle framing is supposed to protect. The contradiction between the speech and the South China Sea reality is not lost on those countries. They are in the audience. They know what the law of the jungle looks like when Beijing is the jungle. Taiwan. China's stated intention to reunify Taiwan, by force if necessary, applies a law of the jungle logic to a self-governing democracy of 23 million people. The framing that Taiwan is an internal Chinese matter rather than a sovereign state is itself an exercise in the kind of powerful state defines the rules behavior that Xi's speech warns against. The 23 million Taiwanese who prefer to determine their own political future are experiencing a version of the law of the jungle that the speech conspicuously does not address. The Uyghur question, the Hong Kong national security law, the Belt and Road debt architecture that has left some smaller states with infrastructure they cannot afford and financial obligations that constrain their sovereignty. Each of these represents a dimension of Chinese behavior that the law of the jungle framing is actively inconsistent with. The speech's global South audience knows this. What makes the speech sophisticated rather than simply hypocritical is that the global South audience is making a comparative calculation, not an absolute one. Compared to their experience of American-led conditionality, Chinese engagement, even with its contradictions, offers a specific set of sovereignty-respecting features that the audience values. The speech is successful not because the audience believes China is a pure multilateral actor, but because the audience has decided that China's version of the rules is more favorable to their interests than Washington's version. Beijing faces the core dilemma of the sophisticated hypocrite, making the most credible possible case for multilateral rules while maintaining the specific behaviors that make the rules conveniently inapplicable to Chinese interests. The dilemma is managed, not resolved, through careful rhetorical construction that emphasizes sovereignty, non-interference principles that benefit China while avoiding explicit engagement with the cases where Chinese behavior violates those same principles. The speech is a product of that management. It is sophisticated communication precisely because it is aware of its own contradictions and is constructed to minimize their resonance in the target audience. Washington faces the mirror image. Having spent 75 years constructing a rules-based order that it genuinely believes in and has substantially maintained, the current administration is providing Beijing with the most valuable possible ammunition for the argument that the American order is an alliance-based hierarchy rather than a universal rules system. The 3-hour reversal, the vessel seizure, the reversed ultimatums, each of those events is more damaging to the American soft power position than any Chinese speech could be, because they are American actions rather than Chinese assertions. Beijing does not need to argue that Washington operates by the law of the jungle if Washington's behavior in the Gulf is making that argument for it. The Global South audience is the actor with the most power in this competition and the least coverage. It is not passive. It is making active alignment decisions, accepting Chinese infrastructure investment while maintaining American security relationships, joining BRICS while keeping WTO membership, accepting Chinese telecommunications infrastructure while buying American weapons systems. The soft power competition is not producing clean victories for either side. It is producing a more genuinely multipolar alignment landscape than either side's preferred narrative acknowledges. Scenario 1. Beijing's soft power offensive succeeds with the Global South target audience. A significant number of countries that were previously reliably aligned with American-led institutions begin treating the Chinese multilateral architecture as a primary rather than supplementary framework, prioritizing BRICS over G7, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank over the World Bank, Chinese development assistance over IMF structural adjustment programs. The American-led order loses the universality that gives it much of its enforcement power. This scenario unfolds gradually over years, rather than through a single decisive event. Scenario 2. The contradictions in Beijing's position become too visible for the Global South audience to manage. A major escalation in the South China Sea, a military action against Taiwan, or a Belt and Road debt renegotiation that visibly harms a smaller state's sovereignty produces a credibility collapse in the law of the jungle framing. Countries that were calculating in favor of Chinese partnership recalibrate toward the American-led order despite its conditionality, because the Chinese alternative proves to offer less sovereignty protection than the speech claimed. This scenario requires a Chinese action sufficiently damaging to smaller states that the comparative calculation reverses. Scenario 3. The American administration's behavior in the Gulf period becomes the defining moment that shifts the global alignment calculation toward Beijing for a generation. If the Gulf crisis ends with a settlement that China can credibly claim to have facilitated, combined with the series of enforcement events, reversed ultimatums, and extension failures that have characterized the American management of the crisis, the narrative of American unpredictability and Chinese constructive engagement consolidates in ways that influence alignment decisions across multiple regions simultaneously. This is Beijing's optimal scenario. It requires no action from China beyond what it is already doing. Scenario 4. A genuine multilateral framework emerges from the Gulf crisis that incorporates both American and Chinese participation, the scenario we traced in earlier videos, producing a precedent for great power cooperation in regional crisis management that neither party can subsequently ignore. That precedent becomes the foundation for a renegotiated international order architecture that is more genuinely multilateral than either the American alliance-based order or the Chinese sovereignty-based alternative. This scenario requires the most from both parties. It is also the one that best serves the Global South countries whose alignment is the competition's real prize. If you are geopolitically curious about the soft power competition that is playing out beneath the surface of the Gulf crisis coverage, if you find yourself fascinated by the question of how a Chinese leader warning against the law of the jungle can be simultaneously right on the substance and compromised as a messenger, the map I have drawn tonight gives you the framework for reading that complexity accurately. The invisible chain connecting the law of the jungle speech to Beijing's real strategic position runs through the fear of American unpredictability, through the alignment calculations of global South countries, through the distinction between two competing rule architectures with different beneficiaries, and through the specific gift that the Gulf crisis has given Beijing's soft power apparatus. A running demonstration of American unpredictability that makes the law of the jungle framing credible to its target audience without requiring China to manufacture it. The geopolitically curious person watching this competition unfold in real time is watching something genuinely important. The contest over which framework for international relations achieves sufficient global legitimacy to function as the organizing principle of the next era of great power competition. It is not settled. It is being decided right now in the alignment choices of countries that are barely visible in the Gulf crisis coverage, and in the soft power moves of a Chinese leader who understands that the law of the jungle speech is more powerful at this specific moment than at any other moment in the past decade. Let me draw the final map. Xi Jinping warned the world against the law of the jungle. He was talking about Trump. The speech is simultaneously right on the substance, compromised in the messenger, and strategically sophisticated in its targeting. The primary audience was not Washington. It was the 50 to 60 global South countries whose alignment decisions will determine which of the two competing international order architectures achieves sufficient scale to be self-sustaining. The distinction between Beijing's sovereignty-based multilateral order and Washington's alliance-based order is the invisible chain that connects this speech to every Chinese diplomatic decision in the Gulf crisis. The fear the speech reveals, American unpredictability as a more destabilizing force than American strength, is Beijing's most honest communication of the current moment. A consistent adversary is manageable. An adversary that reverses positions in 3 hours, seizes Chinese origin vessels, and oscillates between maximum pressure and extension is an adversary that breaks the predictability assumptions on which every Chinese long-term strategic investment is based. The law of the jungle speech is Beijing's way of asking for the kind of American consistency that the current administration is specifically not providing, in diplomatic language, for a global audience, at a moment when American behavior in the Gulf is doing more to advance the argument than any Chinese speech could. The soft power competition is real. Neither side is clearly winning, and the global South audience that is the real prize is making its calculations based on comparative reliability rather than ideological alignment. Understanding that competition and the invisible chains that connect a Chinese leader's public speech to the alignment decisions being made in 50 countries that are barely visible in the Gulf crisis coverage is understanding the most consequential geopolitical process of the current era. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If you were advising a government in the global South right now, watching the Gulf crisis, reading Xi's law of the jungle speech, calculating your own alignment for the next decade, which specific feature of either the American-led order or the Chinese alternative would be most determinative in your calculation? Not ideology, not values. The specific feature that most affects your country's ability to plan its own future. Leave your answer in the comments. The most structurally precise responses I will read in the follow-up.